You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Before we begin, the episode that follows investigates a story of rape and sexual assault and how early American legal culture treated female victims and their male assailants. It goes a long way to help us understand women's legal standing in early American society and the development of our modern-day ideas about victims, assailants, and sexual assault. Ultimately, it is the story of how one woman bravely confronted her rapist and took him to court for his crime. Hello, and welcome to episode 354 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. History tells us who we are and how we came to be who we are. It also allows us to look back and see change over time, and how far we've come as people and societies. Of course, history also has the power to show us how little has changed over time. John Wood Sweet, a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and author of the book The Sewing Girl's Tale, A Story of Crime and Consequences in Revolutionary America, joins us to investigate the first published rape trial in the United States and how one woman, Lanah Sawyer, bravely confronted the man who raped her by bringing him to court for his crime. Now, as we investigate Lanah Sawyer's rape and her legal case, John reveals who Lanah Sawyer was and how she met her rapist, Harry Bedloe. The legal recourse is open to Lanah for reporting her rape and for seeking legal redress. And details about Lanah Sawyer's case and Harry Bedloe's trial and the significance of how it serves as the first published rape trial in United States history. But first, Ben Franklin's World has an electronic newsletter that'll put the show notes for each new episode right in your inbox. If you haven't yet signed up for the Ben Franklin's World Gazette, visit benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. That's benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. And now, allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research specialties are in the social and cultural histories of race, gender, and sexuality during the Revolutionary era, and he's also the author of numerous articles and several books, including The Sewing Girl's Tale, A Story of Crime and Consequences in Revolutionary America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, John Wood Sweet.
Thank you, Liz Covart. I'm delighted to be here.
John, The Sewing Girl's Tale is a story of crime and consequences in Revolutionary America. And I wonder if we could begin our conversation with the scene of the crime. What was New York City like right after the American Revolution? Could you tell us what it would have been like to live in Manhattan during the mid to late 1780s?
So New York City, in the aftermath of the Revolution, was tiny and tumultuous. We think today of the sprawling metropolis with almost 9 million people in it. But in 1793, New York was a town with only about 40,000 people. Almost everybody lived within an easy walk of each other on the southern tip of the island. So pretty much everything north of what is now City Hall was farmland. At that time, it was a dynamic seaport, rapidly rebuilding from the devastation of the Revolutionary War. The city's population doubled in the 1780s and then doubled again during the 1790s. The fall of 1793 was an anxious time in the city. There was a danger of yellow fever, which was a serious disease. That fall, yellow fever killed something like 1 in 10 people in Philadelphia. And as Philadelphians fled, New York worked hard to keep them out. There were patrols at nighttime to keep secret parties of refugees from crossing over the Hudson under the cover of darkness. It was also, in the fall of 1793, a period of real stark and often violent political division. The French Revolution had really exacerbated partisan conflict in the city, setting a radical example of democratic republicanism that many New Yorkers regarded as a nightmare and other New Yorkers saw as an inspiration. By the fall of 1793, Great Britain and France were at war, and France was doing everything it could to drag the United States into the conflict. And on the streets of New York, French and British mariners, along with their New York partisans, were frequently involved in fistfights and small-scale riots that many worried would erupt into an all-out battle between the partisans of what were called aristocracy on the one hand and democracy on the other. Noah Webster arrived in the city just about the time that Lanah Sawyer first met Henry Bedloe, and he was horrified to hear people singing the Marseillaise and chanting Vive la Révolution, and especially chanting Down with King Washington. So New York was a divided and anxious city, and it was a city in which a young woman, 17-year-old Lanah Sawyer, found both opportunity and danger. In this period, the only real way for an ordinary young woman to earn a living wage was through prostitution. And prostitution was big business in New York as it was in most seaports. A crucial part of the action of this story takes place in a brothel that's just off what is now City Hall Park. The brothel was run by a woman named Mother Carey. And as I discovered, there were at least 6 other brothels on her block that fall. 6, that is, that made it into the historical record because they got into trouble.
In my mind, I'm picturing how New York City looks a lot smaller than it does today, located just on the southern tip of Manhattan, and that's where people live. And north of that, you have all that space of Manhattan Island just covered by farms. Places where we'd see high rises and apartment buildings today would have been farm fields. But you also mentioned how New York City is a city. By 1793, it's a place with a lot of crime, disease, and a lot of people. 40,000 people may not seem like a lot of people today, but if we think about just how they're located on the southern tip of Manhattan, that would have been a crowded city. So, John, would it have been possible for someone like Lanah Sawyer, who we'll keep talking about today, but would it have been possible for someone like Lanah Sawyer to remain anonymous in this milieu of 40,000 people, or was it still a small enough place where everybody would have known you, at least by sight, as you're walking around town?
So New York in 1793 was something like a large state university campus. So it's a place where 40,000 people is the kind of place where like different sets of people all know each other, and many people know each other by reputation, but not everybody knows each other by sight. In the same way that on our campus here at UNC, I know a lot of the undergraduates in my classes, but I never interact with some of the people in the Cancer Center.
Okay, I think we have a good sense of what New York City was like by 1793, and that's the scene of the crime. Now, in John's book, The Sewing Girl's Tale, John reconstructs and recounts the story of Harry Bedloe's rape of Lanah Sawyer in September 1793, and the court record for this case stands as the first published report of a rape trial in the new United States. John, before we dig into this case, Americans' views and understandings about a lot of different things have really shifted and changed over time, and I have to assume that that is true of how Americans view and understand rape. So would you tell us how early Americans viewed and understood rape by 1793?
According to the ancient English statute, the definition of the crime was pretty straightforward. Rape was, quote, the carnal knowledge of a woman against her will, unquote. So rape was a crime about consent. And according to the law, as well as according to legal experts, it was among the most heinous of all crimes. In this period, it was a hanging offense. But in practice, few rapists actually ended up getting hanged. Today, we know that most sexual assaults go unreported, and that even when rapes go to trial, it can be difficult for survivors to get meaningful recourse. And in many ways, this case from 1793 seems familiar because this was a moment in which our modern rape culture was being created. And a central part of that shift was the narrowing of the effective legal definition of rape, in which violent surprise attacks by men of relatively low social standing came to be seen as quote-unquote real rape, and assaults among acquaintances, like date rape, in which the perpetrator's social status was typically higher, supposedly became something murkier. Today, we refer to this distinction in terms of stranger rape versus acquaintance rape. And in large part, this distinction has to do with the power politics of prosecution. Prosecuting stranger rapes typically serves the interests of those in power, while prosecuting acquaintance rapes tends to unsettle social hierarchies. So when Lanah Sawyer came forward to prosecute Harry Bedloe in the fall of 1793, it was the first time in almost half a century that anyone had dared to charge a gentleman in New York City with the crime of rape.
So, in this early American legal culture or legal rape culture, if an early American woman had been raped, what recourse did she have to report it? Can you take us through the process of how an early American woman would have reported a rape like Lanah Sawyer did of Harry Bedloe?
Lanah Sawyer's decision to go to the law and charge Henry Bedloe with rape was very unusual at the time. Most women then, as now, don't report sexual assaults, especially when the perpetrator is an acquaintance. Part of the challenge for Lanah Sawyer was that there were a whole series of gatekeepers standing between her and a potential conviction in a court of law. And her case followed a relatively typical pattern, as we know from the work of other scholars like Sharon Block. Lanah arranged to first tell her mother what had happened, and then her mother talked to her stepfather, and then Lanah told her stepfather what had happened. Stepfather ultimately accompanied her and supported her claim when they went to legal authorities. In this case, it was not the police, because there were no police in this period. It was the city's mayor, who then referred the case to the attorney general, who referred the case to a grand jury, who then submitted the case to trial by a trial jury. And each person in this series of gatekeepers had the power to reject Lanah's claim, to deem it unworthy, unlikely to succeed, or to become an ally and to put their authority behind it. And the further she went in this process, the greater the risks were. At each stage, the gatekeeper she was dealing with was more anonymous, less invested in her personal welfare. And at each stage, as is the case today, you lose more and more control over the process. So at the same time, at each stage, the forum became more public. So the downside of losing increased. So it was a risky proposition. And what's remarkable in this case is that she persevered and was so successful at gathering allies as she proceeded through this process.
And it sounds like in this masculine world that the first gatekeeper that Lanah would have to go through and her first ally that she could create was that of her stepfather. And we don't often think of fathers escorting women to court or to a police station to make a claim of rape. So I wonder how typical that was. Why was Lanah's father the first gatekeeper that Lanah would have had to go through?
I think it was very common in this period, in cases involving acquaintance rapes, for the head of a household to be part of the prosecution, to put her weight behind it. So we see that pattern when we look at large numbers of sexual assault cases. There's a kind of patriarchal imprimatur that goes onto a rape claim when the father helps to bring it forward. And it's much easier to dismiss claims when the man of the house isn't there supporting his daughter. There are some cases in which it's a mother that brings the charge. And there are a couple examples I've seen in New York history in which mothers face a lot of difficulties being taken seriously. I think it's a patriarchal logic that if the man of the house won't back a claim, why should anyone else take it seriously?
That logic really says a lot about women's relationships with early American law and the courts as well, in that women didn't seem to have full standing before the court. So in order to get that full standing before the law and before the court, they would have had to have a man in their family step forward to support their claims.
We hear a lot in the modern world about acquaintance rapes, state rapes being difficult to prosecute because they're about some supposedly murky issue of consent. And I think that's not really the case. And I think we see in this case, Lanah Sawyer's prosecution of Henry Bedloe, that the issue, I don't think, is so much about credibility or consent. The issue, I think, is much more about what the philosopher Kate Manne calls himpathy, which is about defining who matters, who counts. And I think that was certainly a challenge sexual assault survivors faced then and now, presenting themselves, being seen in the eyes of jurors as someone who matters.
Okay, now that we have some knowledge about early New York City and how the early American court system works, I think we're ready to dive in to Lanah Sawyer's case. In The Sewing Girl's Tale, John focuses primarily on two actors, Lanah Sawyer and Harry Bedloe. John, what do we know about Lanah Sawyer and her early life? We've already talked a fair bit about her, so help us get to know her better.
So when I first began researching and writing The Sewing Girl's Tale, I knew that I wanted to center the story around Lanah Sawyer even though the men kept threatening to take it over. And I knew that I wanted to make it clear that her story began long before she met Henry Bedloe and continued long after the rape trial. One basic question I had was, where did a young woman like her, a 17-year-old from a modest working family, get the courage to stand up for herself the way she did? And one answer to that question that I was able to piece together is Lanah's family background. And although her family was modest, it was easy for somebody like Harry Bedloe to underestimate her. Lanah's family had deep roots in New York City, where she was born around 1776. Her father was a skilled artisan, a carriage maker, and unlike most families in the city at the time, her family stayed there throughout the war, even as the British took control of the city in the fall of 1776. So she spent her early years in a garrison city, military-occupied city, as the eldest child in a growing family. And then when she was about 7, almost at the end of the war, her father died. And her mother was left with Lanah and 2 other young children. And women's wages in this period were so low that there was no obvious way for her to make ends meet alone. So like most working women in this period, she needed to remarry. And her second husband also had a skilled trade like her first. He was one of the state-appointed branch pilots who was in charge of guiding ships into and out of port. So Lanah came of age living in a household with a stepfather, with a growing number of half-siblings. By 1793, we know she was working as a seamstress to help support the family and earn some money, presumably taking in sewing jobs, as well as presumably helping around the house, taking care of the new baby, etc. At the same time, Lanah also had relations that were surprisingly affluent. Before the war, at a time when most New Yorkers were renters because they couldn't afford to buy their own homes, Lanah's grandmother owned at least 2 houses in the neighborhood where Lanah was living in 1793. And Lanah had a great aunt and uncle who were, in fact, rich. Her uncle had started out as a baker, running the bakery, which was across the street from where Lanah lived in 1793. But he had become rich enough by the 1760s that he had been able to retire from business and rent out the bakery and move to an elaborate country estate up Bowery Lane. And he was even elected one of the city's aldermen, which was a big deal at the time. Aldermen were the magistrates to whom crimes like rape would be reported. So, although he had died some years before 1793, Lanah remained close and connected to that side of the family. She spent, for example, most of the day after she was assaulted, visiting with her great aunt in her aunt's house. One curious thing is that in an unusual arrangement, her widowed aunt was not living up on the estate on Bowery Lane. She was actually living in a house off of the Bowling Green with another widow who was even richer and more prominent, Judith Bayard Van Rensselaer Bruce, who was at the pinnacle of New York's social scene. She was, in fact, the aunt of Alexander Hamilton, and she was from the money side of Alexander Hamilton's family.
So this is an interesting web of relations. You know, the Sawyers were well-to-do tradespeople, what we might consider today to be middle-class people. And Lanah's family has these deep roots in New York City that really allowed her to be at least tangentially connected to some of the wealthiest people in the city. But what about Harry Bedloe, John? What do we know about Bedloe and his connections to New York and his life before he met Lanah Sawyer?
So Harry Bedloe was born into a rich old Dutch family in 1767. So by the fall of 1793, he was 26. At the time he was born, his parents had been trying to have a son for almost 15 years. Their children kept arriving stillborn or dying in infancy. So when Harry was born, his father wrote in his family Bible, "I pray that he will live and grow up in holiness." And he got half of his wish. Harry did live, but there was never anything particularly holy about him. He was never very interested in work. Unlike most of his peers, he didn't go to college. He didn't develop much of a profession. He was never trusted by any of his relations with family business. He liked to think of himself as a gentleman who would basically coast by on his mother's share of the Rutgers family's real estate empire. And indeed, he liked to style himself as the heir at law of his rich and conveniently unmarried uncle Henry Rutgers, after whom Rutgers University is named. Around the time Harry Bedloe met Lanah Sawyer, he had a miniature portrait painted, and it shows a kind of classic high Federalist gentleman. with his hair powdered white and coiffed up into an elaborate do, his skin smooth and pale, his eyes blue with a bit of a twinkle. His lips are rosy red and drawn back into a little bit of a sly smile. It's the look of a man aware of his privilege and reveling in it. So by his mid-20s, Harry Bedloe had developed a reputation as a rake. His own attorneys during the trial admitted that he was well known at Mother Carey's brothel and that he was what they politely called a man of gallantry, meaning that he was accustomed to doing whatever it took to enjoy the pleasures of woman. He was also a spendthrift and was really good at convincing people to loan him money, which he then refused to pay back.
That's quite the contrast in characters, where Lanah came from this hardworking family, and she herself sounds like she was a really hardworking seamstress. Harry Bedloe seems to have coasted through life solely by relying on the wealth of others to get by. He didn't work, he just kind of lounged around in life. I do want to revisit this term rake. When I read sources from early America and come across the word rake, the writers aren't describing a good-natured person. You know, that word reads with all sorts of negative connotations. So I wonder if you would tell us what a rake was and what early Americans meant by the term.
Today, the rake appears mostly in romance novels as kind of a bad boy who has a slight edge of danger to him, but ultimately turns out to be a good guy at the core. And that is in some ways the opposite of the 18th century rake. The 18th century rake presents himself as a good guy and turns out to be evil. So the essence of a rake is that he's the sexual predator. And the rake, in the classic seduction stories of the late 18th century, leaves a trail of ruined woman in his wake. There's a kind of sadistic pleasure to the rake. He takes his pleasure by seducing women and then abandoning them in a way that leaves them open to social ruin. In seduction stories, the woman who has sex with the rake always ends up meeting a terrible end. She typically descends into madness, becomes an alcoholic, becomes a prostitute, or dies an early death. The victim of seduction in this period always dies. That's part of the pleasure that the rake takes. He's kind of a Satan-like figure in which his role is to corrupt young women and leave them destroyed. So the rake is the evil character.
So we're talking about someone that even during his own lifetime was known as a bad man. So how did Lanah Sawyer, this hardworking sewing girl, come to meet this upper-class rake, Harry Bedloe? How did Lanah meet Harry, John?
Lanah met Harry Bedloe on a late summer day in 1793. She was walking down Broadway in New York City when she attracted the attention of a group of Frenchmen who began to harass her. They began to catcall her, and a young gentleman intervened. So he rescued her. He then escorted her home. He asked her out for an evening walk a few nights later, and he introduced himself. My name, he lied, is Lawyer Smith. So Harry Bedloe was aware that he had a reputation as a sexual predator, so he was trying to disguise his true identity and pass under her radar. So the answer is they met under false pretenses. A few days later, they went out for that walk, which started innocently enough with a glass of ice cream, which was a new kind of luxury at the time. And they took a walk around the Battery, which had just been turned into a public park. But that ended with him dragging her, kicking and screaming, into a brothel run by a woman named Mother Carey.
Wow, that is really not a good ending to a walk. Do we know anything more about what went on during this walk, or just that it ended with Harry dragging Lanah, kicking and screaming, into Mother Carey's brothel?
I think there's two things I would say about that evening. The first is that I think Harry Bedloe clearly had a kind of charm that he could turn on. I think he made Lanah feel flattered by his attentions and excited about the possibility of a romance. Imagine him as an engaging companion as they were walking around the Battery, which was a common place for young couples to promenade. So I think he was really working it. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I first encountered the story back in the 1980s, which was right around the time Ms. Magazine coined the term date rape. And the more I've learned about the modern dynamics of date rape, the more familiar this story sounds. It's very common in modern acquaintance rapes for a perpetrator to target an individual, to test their boundaries, to try and get them alone, to isolate them, to make them vulnerable, to maneuver them into a space where they don't have social protections. So in that sense, Harry Bedloe got Lanah out alone. He kept her out late at night. By the time they were walking back home, Lanah was anxious that it was so late her parents would be mad at her for not getting home at a respectable hour. So already she's feeling defensive. And then the date rapist in our modern world often uses a sense of surprise to help overpower his victim. And so Lanah didn't realize until it was too late that she really was dealing with Henry Bedloe, the rake, that she wasn't dealing with some nice young lawyer Smith. And the acquaintance rapist takes advantage of that shock and surprise and that feeling of being disoriented to make his assault. In this case, he also physically overpowered her and dragged her into the brothel, which was a production because at first Mother Carey didn't want to let them in. And he ended up dragging her around to the back door where they were admitted. But I think that part of what makes acquaintance rape different from stranger rapes is that the acquaintance rapist is often a man of equal or higher status who uses a variety of social cues and social authority to make his victim vulnerable and then exploits that power. It's often with the least violence that he needs to use. Whereas the stranger rapist typically has no social connection, no social authority over his target and uses brute sheer force to perpetrate the assault.
From our modern time and our knowledge of modern law, I think we might see Mother Carey and her establishment as being complicit in the sexual assault and rape of Lanah Sawyer. But how did brothels operate in 1793, John? I think when most of us think of brothels, we're picturing these modern-day television series that we have, usually about the West, and women just kind of live in the brothels and men come and visit them. I don't think we see scenes in these television shows where a man is bringing a woman into the brothel for the purposes of sexual assault and rape. So was it customary for men like Harry Bedloe to bring women into a brothel to commit sexual assault in 1793?
Yeah, in this period, I refer to this as a brothel, and it was often at the time described as a brothel. More technically, this was a bawdy house, which could also be called a house of assignation. So in the 18th century, a brothel like Mother Carey's was kind of a hybrid institution. There were bordellos like your modern bordello in big cities like London and Paris. But in New York, and what was most common, was to have brothels like Mother Carey's. I think she had a servant living in the house and 2 other women who were presumably working as prostitutes in the house. But if a man came with a special request or she didn't have enough women to go around, she would send out for somebody else. Street walkers might come to Mother Carey's to rent a room because they needed a place to go. This wasn't a city full of anonymous hotels. So a brothel played the role of a no-tell-motel in this period. The other advantage for Henry Bedloe of bringing Lanah to a brothel was that just by association with a brothel implied she had been up to something shameful.
I know we want to know what happened to Lanah Sawyer and what Lanah Sawyer did after Harry Bedloe took her to Mother Carey's brothel and raped her. But I also think we need a quick breather from this harrowing case. So here's a word of thanks to our episode sponsor. Women played important and at times unexpected roles in early America. Roles that would help advance and shape what would become the United States. The Colonial Williamsburg Foundation honors women and the important work they contributed to early American societies with a slate of special programming during Women's History Month. Come to Colonial Williamsburg and hear how the women and men who created the United States discussed and debated the rights of women in Nation Builders Discuss the Rights of Women program. Or visit the art museums of Colonial Williamsburg for programs about women's material culture, or the items that women used, wore, and made. Programs like one about quilts and the women who made them, or the articles of clothing and accessories that made up women's dress and fashion, or about how women created and influenced the development of popular fashions with the shoes they made, purchased, and wore. Join the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation this March and every March for its special Women's History Month programming. To learn more, visit benfranklinsworld.com/CWWomen. That's benfranklinsworld.com facebook.com/CW Women. John, what did Lanah Sawyer do after Harry Bedloe took her to Mother Carey's and raped her?
Lanah's response the morning after was not at all what Harry Bedloe or the brothel keeper Mother Carey had expected. I think they both imagined that the morning after she would want to slink away in shame and silence, that she would keep their secrets, that she wouldn't dare to do anything that would cause trouble for either of them, because she would have an even greater incentive to keep what had happened secret. A key moment happened when Lanah Sawyer, who had been sitting alone in Mother Carey's back room, sewing back together her gown, which had been damaged during the assault, and she stepped into the corridor. And Mother Carey was waiting there. So it's this tiny corridor, 3 feet wide, and Mother Carey is standing there, ready to kind of cast Lanah in her preferred role for Lanah. She said, "Dearie, I can show you out the back door, or I can check and see if there's anyone on the street out front." And Lanah said to her, "No, I will go out the front door, and I don't care who sees me, even if it's my father." So there's this remarkable flash of anger and defiance in which Lanah is saying, I am not going to play according to your script. I'm not going to be shamed and intimidated by what happened in your house. But then as soon as Lanah gets out the front door, I think that energy, that anger, that indignation, that outrage, and the courage that she had just shown evaporated. And she found herself distressed and disoriented. And she spent most of that day reeling as she tried to make sense of what had happened. I think she was traumatized and disoriented. I know she really wanted to go home for the comfort of her family, but she was also afraid of going home. So she did a couple things that were kind of interesting. First, she walked over to the bathhouse, the public bathhouse on the Hudson River. But instead of going in, which was expensive, she sat on the banks of the river in kind of an open green area, where a gentleman passing by stopped to talk to her because she looked so distressed that he was afraid she would kill herself. She then went to a rich aunt's house, Mrs. Bruce's house on the Bowling Green, and spent the afternoon there. And it was clear to the people present that afternoon, the woman present that afternoon, that she was upset. But everybody respected her privacy and nobody asked her any questions. Eventually, as nightfall approached, I think Lanah realized she had to go home. And she eventually made her way north through the city, recruited a friend to escort her back home, which was another very common thing that young women facing difficulties like this did, was go first to peers. And by the time Lanah got home, her parents were out looking for her. They were scouring the city. They'd been worried about her, presumably, all day.
When Lanah reconnected with her family, what did she tell them? Did she volunteer that something bad had happened to her, that she'd been sexually assaulted, or did she spend her evening like she spent her day, around family and friends, but just visibly upset and traumatized and not saying anything about it?
Yeah, so one of the reasons it took Lanah so long to go home and face her family was that she was afraid that her stepfather, who had a reputation as a violent man, would beat her up without hearing her story. While he was out looking for her, he told a friend that if Lanah was in the right, he wouldn't say anything to her, but that if she were in the wrong, he would disown her and kick her out of the house. So Lanah knew that she needed to get to her mother first. And this was actually a common pattern. So when Lanah found that her parents weren't home because they were out looking for her, she went across the street to family friends who were running the bakery. And she sat there with Baker's wife and her cousin, who was also there. And they didn't ask her any questions. Eventually, her mother came home and was sent over. And her mother was so agitated and violent and angry that Lanah certainly didn't tell her what had happened. But her cousin, who was there, separated them and said, Lanah, you better come home with me tonight and deal with your mother in the morning when everybody's calmed down a bit. So Lanah actually spent the night upon coming home, not at home, but a couple houses down in her cousin's house. And then her mother arrived the next morning and she told her mother what had happened. And that was also a kind of a brutal attack. Her mother arrived, pushed Lanah without speaking, pushed her onto a bed, lifted up her skirts to examine her linens and see whether they were bloody or not, whether there were signs of violence and of intercourse on her body, on her linens, which there was. Then the mother listened to her story. And it's clear that the mother came around because her mother then went down the street and got her stepfather, who came to the cousin's house and listened to Lanah's story himself. Stepfather's reaction is really fascinating. And it suggests to me that the problem he saw was not so much whether to believe Lanah, believe that she had been assaulted by Bedloe, but rather a strategic question of whether it was better to hush what had happened up or to go try and seek legal recourse. And he did two things that were really quite unusual. First, he launched a kind of investigation of his own. He got his friend, the baker, and he told Lanah, "You're coming with us. We are going to go talk to Mother Carey." So they went to confront Mother Carey. Lanah did not want to go. He made her. So there's a kind of re-victimization there. And Mother Carey lied to them. Mother Carey said, "I don't know who this girl is. I've never seen her before in my life." My reading of that incident is that John Callanan, Lanah's stepfather, realized that Mother Carey was lying. And the fact that Mother Carey was lying gave him confidence that Lanah was not just telling the truth, but that Lanah could be persuasive. Second, he took Lanah Sawyer to a private attorney. And this was not one of the high-powered establishment lawyers that Henry Bedloe's family ended up hiring by the dozen. Instead, this was a young attorney who had just passed the bar and was just establishing a practice. But nonetheless, he was a competent attorney, and I think they had two questions for him. One was, how did their case look in terms of a legal prosecution? Would her story be prosecutable? And second, I think what's interesting is they had the attorney prepare a written statement, a written complaint to bring to the magistrate. Both of those are about trying to understand the situation, understand their options, and to assert a kind of control. Because I think Callanan, as well as Lanah, had good reason to be worried about losing control of a prosecution. That was a risky venture because they faced substantial possibility of retaliation and dishonor. So then they went to the mayor, and from there went to the attorney general and grand jury.
As we stated at the beginning, Lanah Sawyer's case, her lawsuit against Harry Bedloe, stands as the first published account and court record of rape in the new United States. John, as a historian, what does this case physically look like? And what does the information contained in this record reveal about Harry Bedloe's trial and how it was conducted? Do we know if Lanah and her father or stepfather were able to keep control of her case?
So the published report appeared as like a 60-something page pamphlet, and it gives a remarkable view of this trial. We hear Lanah Sawyer's testimony and her cross-examination. We hear the testimony of the various prosecution and defense witnesses and their cross-examinations. We hear the closing arguments made by the various attorneys, and I should point out that Henry Bedloe's family hired 6 of the nation's leading attorneys to defend him, and 5 of them gave closing arguments. And we hear the judge's charge to the jury. We also hear some of the reactions of spectators. The courtroom was packed. It was a huge room. This was a room that was originally created to house the U.S. Congress. The spectator galleries were full, and the spectators were active, clapping and hissing to express their disapproval or their approval of what the attorneys were saying. I think what is most notable about this trial is the defense strategy, which was really an audacious effort to shift the law of rape. In fact, to shift the law of rape so far that it would become virtually impossible for somebody like Lanah Sawyer to mount a successful prosecution against somebody like Henry Bedloe. When talking about the law of rape, we often hear about Sir Matthew Hale, a 17th century English jurist who wrote a series of commentaries, English criminal law, and especially he's notable for his comments about rape trials. He was famously misogynistic, persuaded that women tended to be naturally vindictive and malicious, and he was concerned about what would happen when gentlemen like him were falsely accused of sexual assault by lower-class women. So he proposed a series of circumstantial tests to evaluate the credibility of a woman charging a man with sexual assault. And these were essentially criteria that made it easier for a woman who had survived an attack from a low-class stranger to pass, and tests that made it much more difficult for a woman assaulted by an acquaintance to pass. He, for example, said that a woman was more credible if she reported the assault while it was recent. And what's most remarkable about this rape trial is that while even the prosecution admitted that Hale was an important authority on the law of rape, but the defense wasn't satisfied with what Hale had actually written. So they kept rewriting what he had written to make it as extreme as possible. So, for example, Hale said a woman was more credible if she reported the crime while it was recent. Bedloe's attorney said that what Hale had actually said, which he hadn't, was that a woman had to report a crime immediately, that she should have pursued a hue and cry. She'd have chased Bedloe into the street in front of Mother Carey's house and called on bystanders to arrest him. The ancient definition of rape involved consent against her will, but increasingly in the 18th century, it was common to insert the word force, by force and against her will. And Hale had included circumstantial evidence of violence as indicators that a woman might be telling the truth. Was her clothing torn and bloodied? Did she have marks on her body that suggested violence? Had she cried out for assistance? Bedloe's attorneys took that and ran with it. And one of the most audacious arguments was that, yes, Henry Bedloe may very well have used a certain amount of force, but it wasn't, they claimed, the kind of force that constitutes a rape. So Richard Harrison, one of the prominent attorneys, said, any gentleman knows that in order to preserve the delicacy of a woman, you have to use a little bit of force in sex. Otherwise, she would have to admit to having carnal desires. So it's really just protecting her innocence and her virtue that you force her into sex. But he says that was just normal force in sex, not the kind of violence that constitutes a rape. The most harrowing part of this trial for Lanah may well have been the discussion that circled around another of Hale's comments, which was that a woman was more credible if she was of good fame, which means did she have a good reputation? And Lanah clearly had a good reputation. The prosecution presented a variety of character witnesses who all testified that they knew her well and that she had a flawless character for prudence and modesty and virtue. So Bedloe's attorneys said, all right, well, we really shouldn't be thinking about reputation because it's easy to hide under a false reputation. What we really should be looking at is Lanah's inner character. And because there was no evidence of Lanah's inner character, because what kind of forensic evidence can you produce of somebody's inner character? They had free rein to speculate. And they spent, I think, hours speculating about how corrupt and depraved Lanah Sawyer's inner character could be. They said, how do we know that under her virtuous exterior, she's not harboring dark desires? So they spent a lot of the trial casting aspersions and innuendo at Lanah Sawyer. Ultimately, they ended up finding a way to use her own good reputation against her by making it seem like it was a pretense that she was hiding something, and his bad reputation in his favor. So at one point, an attorney who lived 2 doors away from her said, what did a mere sewing girl like her think a gentleman like him had in mind when he asked her out? His conclusion was that Lanah had pre-consented to have sex the moment she stepped off her stepfather's stoop. And this is really not so much about disputing consent or credibility. I think this really is about what Kate Mann calls himpathy. They were defining Henry Bedloe as somebody who mattered, and they were trying to define Lanah Sawyer as someone who didn't matter. A key moment came in the trial when one of Bedloe's attorneys exclaimed, as if in horror, the life of a citizen is in the hands of a woman.
So what happened? What was the outcome of this trial?
I think the trial itself was harrowing for Lanah Sawyer and her family. It was a trial that lasted up until about 1 o'clock in the morning. And much of that was spent casting aspersions on Lanah Sawyer and questioning her truthfulness and her sexual comportment. And then the jury deliberated for 15 minutes and returned a verdict that surprised a lot of people in the courtroom because the verdict was not guilty. I think a lot of people thought that her case was very strong. And then there was silence. And then about a week later, the city exploded in outrage. And I haven't found any parallel in early American history. One evening, hundreds of men gathered at nightfall outside of Mother Carey's brothel and began attacking it with cobblestones from the streets. She fired a shot. Somebody in her house fired a shot. People said it was her. Then she fled out the back entrance, and the rioters climbed up to the roof of the house, began tearing the shingles apart. They literally tore the house apart. They threw the furniture out the windows. They tore the beds open, threw them into the street, and in the morning, all that was left was a pile of rubble and a cloud of feathers. Meanwhile, some of the rioters had split off and begun to attack other brothels, and the next night they gathered again. In all, more than half a dozen brothels were destroyed during these riots. Bedloe himself fled the city, afraid that he would be targeted. His family hired armed guards. The families of some of the attorneys were worried that their houses would be attacked. But in the end, they weren't. The rioters focused on brothels run by women, which it's hard to know for sure, but women were about half of all bawdy housekeepers in the city at this point. The city's mayor, who had played a role in this prosecution, was unhappy about the riots. But his response only made things worse. He had a reputation as kind of a high federalist, a haughty, austere man. And he published a high-handed notice in the newspapers the next day, attacking the rioters as low-class rabble, as boys, as apprentices, and as quote-unquote Negroes. So he added insult to injury, because the rioters in this period were typically not the bottom of the social scale. And in this case, everybody kind of assumed the man who organized the riots was Lanah's stepfather, John Callanan. And he had a wide social network. The family was connected to the city's firefighters, as well as the maritime community. So the mayor was insulting the rioters by saying that the city's virtuous household head should keep their charges in line. And I think the mayor really put his finger on the sore nerve that had sparked the riots in the first place. You might wonder, why did the city's working men come to see the Bedloe trial as an attack on themselves? And I think the answer is a growing sense of class resentment and a demand for a more democratic political order. I think the city's working men were sick and tired of the city's self-proclaimed elites treating working people like themselves as people who didn't matter. And I think at the same time, we see that the rioters chose specific targets that represent their own kind of masculine, patriarchal sense of identity. They chose brothels run by women. So the rioters were angry at elite men, but they displaced that anger by attacking women they defined as sexually disorderly. And I think that raises a set of questions that we still deal with in ordinary life today. There's a kind of slippage between alliance, who is allied with Lanah Sawyer in this case, and who is appropriating her ordeal for their own purposes.
Was that it? Is that how Lanah Sawyer and her stepfather got justice for Lanah, was through these mob actions?
No. There are a couple of things that happened next. After the riots, there was a wide-ranging newspaper controversy about this case and more broadly about sexual double standards. So reports of the riots and debate about the city's response ramified up and down the nation. First, the launch sparked a massive newspaper war, debating the riots, debating the Bedloe trial itself, and debating sexual double standards for women. One of the most remarkable things I found in the newspaper war was the number of powerful, articulate feminist voices that emerged. There was a woman calling herself Justicia and another woman calling herself Mariah, who forcefully argued about that the trial represented an injustice, that the city should be less focused on keeping brothels available to elite men and focused on making the city safe for ordinary women. And in a way, that's an echo of the Title IX argument that colleges should be responsible for curbing the problem of sexual assault to provide equal opportunity for all their students. So I thought that newspaper debate itself was fascinating. After the newspaper debate died down, kind of the second act of the story begins, when Lanah's stepfather, John Callanan, filed a civil suit against Henry Bedloe for seduction.
That's not something we really hear about today, seduction suits. John, what was a seduction suit?
The seduction suit was a fascinating and completely bizarre form of civil action that dates back to the mid-18th century. And it's based on a crazy set of patriarchal conventions and legal fictions. The seduction lawsuit has its origins in master-servant law. The idea of a seduction suit is, say you, Liz, tried to hire away my cook. I would then sue you to get my cook back on the grounds that you had improperly seduced away my cook and then deprived me of having good meals during that period. So I would sue you for money damages, supposedly equivalent to the value of the labor my servant had not been able to perform because she was now in your service. So the seduction suit then moved from master-servant law to a form of action available to remedy certain kinds of sexual harms. And specifically, the seduction suit was available generally to men, to heads of households, when one of their daughters had been seduced, or if their wife had been seduced by another man. There are cases in which an older brother or a widow is a plaintiff, but typically it's a father. And so one of the crazy things about a seduction suit is that the father is claiming money damages for the sexual violation of his daughter. It's not the woman herself claiming money damages for the actions against her. It's somebody else. So there's this crazy patriarchal logic to it. And theoretically, the argument is that the woman who is seduced is supposedly to be understood as a servant who failed to perform the domestic labor she owed her household head during the time that she was being seduced. However, everybody knows that the actual damages have nothing to do with her actual labor value or services expected to be rendered, that it's a symbolic way of holding a man accountable. In the period up until 1793, until the 1790s, until Lanah Sawyer's case, damage awards were generally pretty modest. Generally, people brought seduction suits if a daughter, a young woman, became pregnant, and the suit generally resulted in an award that was equivalent basically to the practical costs of childbirth and early child support. So these were like child support claims. And these suits almost never took place unless the woman in question got pregnant, for the obvious reason that most families who had a daughter who ended up being seduced, who didn't end up pregnant, chose to cover up the affair rather than make it public. And because the amount of damages that were available were so modest. Another thing that's interesting about these cases is that consent was in fact central to a seduction suit. But in seduction suits, the plaintiff almost always wins. Well, I've seen like one case in which the plaintiff didn't win in a seduction suit. So unlike rape prosecutions in which it's common for the defendant to get off, in seduction suits, the defendant almost never is acquitted. But the issue of consent is not the woman's consent. The issue of consent is the patriarch's consent. So John Callanan's seduction suit would be basically Henry Bedloe, against my will, had sex with my daughter. And what's remarkable is that when that's the case, consent is never debated. And that's not because the legal standard in civil cases was different from the legal standard in criminal cases. Today, we have this preponderance of evidence as a standard in civil cases and beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal cases. But that was just being floated as an idea in London during this period. So there's really two differences. One is that seduction suits involve money. And typically in a seduction suit, the consent in question was not a young woman's, it was an older man's. What's remarkable about Lanah Sawyer's case, and in some ways unique about Lanah Sawyer's case, was that there was no pregnancy and that the money damages were spectacular. The money damages they claimed was £5,000, which is like 20 times what's common in a seduction suit. And the award they got was also substantial, £1,800, which was something like the amount of money it would take to buy a block or two of Manhattan in this period. There's a symbolic unity to this moment because the seduction suit took place in the same courtroom that the rape trial had taken place, and it took place almost a year to the date afterwards. And the seduction suits end with this remarkable moment of vindication for Lanah Sawyer in the eyes of the jury, in the eyes of the city, and this incredible rebuke, clearly intended to be punitive damages, levied against Henry Bedloe.
So what happened to Lanah Sawyer and her family after they win this seduction suit? Did they get Harry Bedloe to pay up? Did Lanah's stepfather share some of this award money with Lanah and help her raise her stature in the city after this horrible experience?
So after Lanah Sawyer and her stepfather won this amazing jury verdict in the seduction suit, the next step was not as obvious as it might at first appear. This is a common problem in damage awards in the present, and it certainly was in the 1790s, which is that it's easier to get a money judgment against somebody than it is to get them to actually pay up. And in this case, the battle over the money went on for years. John Callanan's legal tactics were severe. He chose the harshest possible remedy to non-payment, which was to have Henry Bedloe locked up in debtor's prison. So Henry Bedloe spent almost 2 years locked up in the city's debtor's prison, which was a nasty place to be locked up. And I think Callanan was assuming that Henry Bedloe's family would cough up the money to bail him out. They'd feel bad for him. And Henry Bedloe's rich family did not. What they did do was they hired Alexander Hamilton, who just coming back to the city and reestablishing his law practice after having been Secretary of the Treasury. They hired Alexander Hamilton to find a way to get Henry Bedloe out of prison. I don't think we want to go into too much of the details, but I'll just say that Hamilton's legal strategies were fraudulent and cruel. And ultimately, Bedloe and Callanan were forced to negotiate a compromise. I think Callanan ended up getting about half of what was initially due to him in the legal judgment, maybe 3/4. And he seems to have used a good deal of that money to buy himself a house. He moved around the corner from the house they'd rented to a new house that he owned. There's no evidence of whether Lanah got a cut of that money or not. So whether she benefited materially, I don't know.
What became of Harry Bedloe and Lanah Sawyer after this trial, and after Lanah's stepfather finally gets some financial recompense from Bedloe's family?
You know, the story of what happened to Henry Bedloe and to Lanah Sawyer after this ordeal is illustrative of the ways in which the historical archive privileges men and privileges the affluent. So we know a lot more about what happened to Henry Bedloe in his after story than we do about what happened to Lanah Sawyer. In his after story, for the rest of his long life, Henry Bedloe pretty much left behind a trail of slime. After the seduction suit, which he refused to pay, he was imprisoned, he finally got out of prison, but he never really amounted to much. He has had a series of children out of wedlock, and then he got married and had a series of children in wedlock. But despite a considerable inheritance from his parents, who died of yellow fever in 1798, he always struggled financially. So he was never able to really manage the real estate business effectively. And he spent a lot of his adult life in insolvency proceedings and in debtors' prisons for reasons that had nothing to do with Lanah Sawyer. His rich uncle, Henry Ruckers, described him once in a letter to a family member as a broken man, and other relations made sure that Bedloe would inherit no part of their vast estates. What we know about Lanah Sawyer, I think, is most importantly that she moved on with her life. We know that she got married, and we know that she moved away. For a time at least, it seems that she was living in Philadelphia, presumably looking for a fresh start in a new place where her past would not define her future.
John, we've been talking about a very old rape case. It took place more than 200 years ago. So why do you think it's important for us to learn about Lanah Sawyer and her rape so long after it happened?
So Liz, I think there are a couple different reasons. I think first, it's an inherently dramatic and engaging story. It happened more than 200 years ago, but it feels immediate, surprising, and shockingly modern. When I ask students to read Lanah Sawyer's case, they are often surprised that it took place so long ago, but it seems like it could happen just as easily today. Second, I think this is an historical window into the origins of modern rape culture and origins of modern gender ideas around sexuality. So in this case, we see this gap beginning to widen between how our society treats sexual coercion among acquaintances and what is sometimes called real rape. And I think in the seduction suits, we see a wedge being driven between women who embody a kind of middle-class white ideal of purity and innocence and other women whose sexual integrity is not respected in the same way. Finally, at a basic humanistic level, I think we read stories, whether they're true or fictional, to make better sense of our world, to try to understand the experiences of other people. And so for me, this project has been about developing insight and empathy while also respecting the limits of what I can know. What gave Lanah Sawyer the courage to stand up for herself? How did she recover from the kind of despair that drove her to attempt suicide? How did her assailant come to think of himself as the real victim? I think this is a story with tragedy as well as triumph, but I think there's also a kind of solace. I was talking to a friend recently who said that the way the book is written, keeping Lanah's experience at the center of the story, keeping her always in focus, made the book feel intimate and intense in a way. And she said that the experience of following Lanah Sawyer, taking it seriously, encouraged herself as a reader to reflect on her own life and to honor her own experiences of harassment and violence that she usually keeps compartmentalized and discounts. I think we live in this modern world with so much exploitation and harassment, so much shame and silence. So at some level, I think this book is an invitation to all of us to take our own experiences seriously, to trust in ourselves.
Now we should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. John, in your opinion, what might have happened if Harry Bedloe had been found guilty and convicted of rape? Do you think his conviction would have impacted the history of rape cases and rape culture in the early United States in any way?
I think there are two possible scenarios, and one, sadly, seems more likely. I think it's quite possible that if he had been convicted, he would have ended up being pardoned or ended up getting his sentence commuted, because the courts at the time, shockingly often, refused to enter sentences for men found guilty of rape or immediately recommended them for pardon or commutation. So there is a good chance that he would not have actually been held accountable according to the law. And I think if that had been the case, nothing much would have changed in the trajectory this trial helped push the law of rape towards. On the other hand, if he had been held accountable and had been punished under law, I think that would have been a real corrective to the legal strategies that his attorneys had tried to employ in the case. I think that it was a window into how the informal culture of the law changes over time. And it changes by attorneys trying out strategies and seeing if they work. And in this case, they tried these really extreme misogynistic tactics that succeeded. So, of course, they were copied. And they established a new precedent for not a Supreme Court-style precedent, but a new example of how to succeed in the defense of a man accused of acquaintance rape. So I think that emboldened and helped push the law in that direction. And I think a conviction, on the other hand, would have repudiated that effort. That would have shown that that strategy had not succeeded and would have helped pull the law back in what seems to me a better direction.
So, John, what aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
I'm writing a book about Venture Smith, who was the author of the first American slave narrative, which was published in New London, Connecticut in 1798. Out of something like 12 million survivors of the Middle Passage from Africa to the Americas, he was one of only about a dozen or so who published their own accounts. It's a story of slavery and freedom in the age of revolution, but it's also a story of the ongoing American struggle for equality under the law.
If we have more questions about Lanah Sawyer, Harry Bedloe, and rape in early America, where can we reach you to ask our questions?
Well, you can always find me through the UNC History Department's website. But for this project in particular, the best place to go is my own personal website, which is www.johnwoodsweet.com.
John Woodsweet, thank you for joining us and for sharing Lanah Sawyer's story with us.
Thanks, Liz. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Lanah Sawyer's case against Harry Bedloe stands as the first published rape trial in United States history. As we heard from John, the trial was both harrowing and riveting, and it's because of the interest and excitement around Lanah Sawyer and her father's work to bring Bedloe to justice that we have a clear window onto the legal culture of the early United States and how early Americans viewed and understood crimes of rape and sexual assault. According to ancient English statutes and common law, legal understandings that the new United States largely adopted and amended throughout its history. According to ancient English statutes and common law, rape was understood to be the carnal or sexual knowledge of a woman against her will. Early Americans understood rape as a crime about consent. They also viewed it as a heinous crime and a hanging offense. But in early America, just as now, women had a hard time obtaining any meaningful recourse against the men who raped and sexually assaulted them. This is why then, as now, most sexual assaults go unreported. And investigating Lanah Sawyer's experiences during Harry Bedloe's trial helps us understand why so few women bring their assailants to court. As John revealed, Lanah Sawyer's reputation and word were always under a microscope. No one would take Lanah's word on its own merit. For people to believe her, Lanah first had to convince her head of household, her stepfather, that Harry Bedloe had raped her. Then, during the trial, Bedloe's lawyers worked to savage her reputation and character by wildly speculating as to whether or not she desired Bedloe's sexual assault. After all, they declared, Lanah Sawyer might really have a depraved inner character. John's read of the historical sources is that Lanah would have experienced the trial and the buildup of the trial as a harrowing time, a time when everyone seemed to doubt her and worked to poke holes in her story. Seen in this light, we can see just how brave Lanah was for standing up to Bedloe and standing up for herself. We can also see how rape culture within the United States started with a focus on the male victim. Rape cases were more about the reputation and social standing of male assailants than they were about the physical and emotional crimes committed against female victims. Even in our own modern day, where we have DNA tests and photo documentation of abuse, cases of rape and sexual assault haven't changed a whole lot in their focus. They still focus on reputation, social standing, and issues of consent. Look for more information about John, his book, The Sewing Girl's Tale, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. BenFranklin'sWorld.com/354. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. If you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios: Joseph Edelman, Holly White, Ian Tonett, and Taylor Fisher. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, Lanah Sawyer's story offered us a look at the actions and deeds of a brave woman. What other brave women would you like to learn about? Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.